Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The Japanese surprise attack launches the United States into World War II. As Allied forces begin their epic struggle to drive the Japanese out of the Pacific, a British journalist has exclusive access to their campaign. Armed with his color movie camera, he captures dramatic footage from some of the most savage conflicts of World War II. He travels with the troops as they battle to recapture Borneo, New Guinea, and the Philippines. He has privileged access to the great war leader, General Douglas MacArthur, and follows him to Japan in August 1945 to film the historic surrender. In Japan, he witnesses the devastation of the atom-bombed cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the Japanese nation coming to terms with their bitter defeat. This is the unique story of the war seen through one man's lens, a journalist with behind-the-scenes access to tell the story of the endgame in the Pacific. In December 1941, British journalist William Courtney is traveling the Pacific Northwest on a mission for his government. He's trying to convince reluctant Americans to join the fight against Adolf Hitler. The United States has an official policy of isolationism. Courtney hopes to change that, and history is about to make his job much easier.
I was in Seattle. That night, I was to address some 8,000 workers from Boeing Aircraft Works at the local auditorium. It was noon on the coast. That fateful Sabbath which was to sound the death knell of American isolationism.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on that Sunday, December 7th, brings the United States into the war. Courtney's mission complete, now he senses an opportunity. He secures a press badge to cover battles in the Pacific for the British press. And in the spring of 1942, he sets sail with American troops from San Francisco. He's the only British journalist granted privileged access to the U.S. military.
We steamed under the Golden Gate at San Francisco in fair weather, watched the land recede, wondered what adventures lay before us, and when we would all see America again.
A month later, Courtney arrives in Australia and immediately gets to work as a war correspondent for the Sunday Times and Daily Sketch newspapers. It's in Australia that Courtney first meets General Douglas MacArthur, the man later dubbed an American Caesar. MacArthur has just fled the Philippines from the advancing Japanese. Courtney is there with the rest of the press pack on March 21st, 1942, when the general arrives in Melbourne. On his shoulders rests the immense burden of defeating a triumphant Japan.
Excitement ran like wildfire through Melbourne. He had captivated the public fancy of America more than any other general since Lee and Grant in the days of the Civil War.
For MacArthur, now Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific, the fight against the Japanese is personal. After their successful attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese have advanced across the Pacific. MacArthur has been forced to retreat from his headquarters in the Philippines. It has been a bitter humiliation. He vows, "I shall return," words that become his mantra. MacArthur and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz launch a grueling and costly island-hopping campaign against a determined enemy. Their two-pronged advance to recapture the Pacific Islands will take over 3 years of brutal island-to-island combat. The ultimate goal, an invasion of Japan. Their campaign brings the might of the U.S. Air Force and Navy to bear on an enemy who will stop at nothing. But within months of the campaign's start, MacArthur and Nimitz' tactics begin to pay off. In May and June 1942, Nimitz wins a series of decisive naval victories at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway.
Navy planes roared from the decks of our carriers, thundered destruction over a 300-mile battle area. The Battle of Midway is over.
As the Allies celebrate the victory at Midway, William Courtney is covering the campaign in New Guinea. As a decorated World War I pilot, he's no stranger to combat. Out in the field, Courtney strikes up a close friendship with MacArthur that gives him privileged access with his camera. In 1943, he takes part in multiple landings and films the general's troops as they battle their way through the Pacific. Courtney has with him his 16mm movie camera, using the new color Kodachrome film. He has no training as a cameraman, but he manages to capture a behind-the-scenes record of life with the troops. And he isn't shy about appearing in front of the camera himself, often handing it over to the men he's with. MacArthur's task is difficult. The only way to defeat Japan is to prise their grip from their island fortresses one by one. Courtney films a new type of warfare as the general launches a series of mass amphibious assaults, each backed by air and naval bombardment. For the first time, these amphibious forces are able to transport and land whole armies with all their weapons. No other nation can match the might and sophistication of these US-led operations. Courtney is with the 1st Cavalry Division on February 29, 1944, as it leads one of the most decisive amphibious attacks of the war so far, an assault on the Admiralty Islands, north of New Guinea. The islands contain Los Negros, home to the Momote airfield, one of the key assault objectives for the Allies. They're also ideally situated to cover the Allied advances along the New Guinea coast. The 1st Cavalry Division is made up mainly of Texans. It's the best trained American division yet to go into action in the Pacific. Courtney shoots behind-the-scenes footage of the men just hours before the assaults begin. The writer Norman Mailer, who also served in the Pacific Campaign, captures the mood of foreboding before such landings.
Nobody could sleep. When morning came, assault craft would be lowered, and a first wave of troops would ride through the surf and charge ashore. All over the ship, all through the convoy, there was knowledge that in a few hours, some of them were going to be dead.
As the 1st Cavalry Division prepares for the assault on Los Negros, Courtney films the first bombardment and landing operations.
From air and sea, we prepared the way. The succession of bombs resembled the rat-tat of machine guns, while hundreds of shells from each ship plastered the coast on both sides of the harbor entrance.
The brutal bombardment forces the Japanese enemy out of their entrenched positions and into full retreat. The 1st Cavalry Division lands at Los Negros unopposed. Thousands of troops swarm onto the beachhead, bringing with them tons of heavy equipment and supplies. By early afternoon, the 1st Cavalry Division secures its initial target, the Momote airstrip, with very little opposition. MacArthur is one step closer to the Philippines. Almost the moment it is captured, the airfield is put to use by Allied ground attack aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force. Reinforcements continue to file ashore for hours after the first landings, and the relief for those who've made it onto Los Negros is enormous. Over the next few weeks, the troops repel several ferocious Japanese counterattacks as the Allies tighten their grip. By May 18, 1944, the Admiralty Islands are securely in MacArthur's hands. The campaign to recapture the Pacific Islands is advancing. Along with filming the action, William Courtney has exclusive access to the Allied troops in the field. He spends his time flying from island to island with his camera, recording what he sees.
Jungle warfare has its humours and comedies, just like on any other front. Wherever British, Australian or American troops are found, they have a way of making their own fun, even in the worst of country conditions or unimaginable hardship.
A few of us at a time were taken by small boats to the beach for a swim. We had no swimming suits, so we skinny dipped. Wading out to sea in water about 2 feet deep, a jeep load of wax passed along the beach. We all four faced the young ladies and waved.
One favorite pastime of the troops is to trade in souvenirs found among dead Japanese soldiers on the battlefield, including Japanese propaganda instructing Allied troops on how they should surrender. The most sought-after trophy is the Japanese samurai sword.
The Japanese officer considers it a point of honor to have his sword dipped in the blood of his enemies. Most of the captured swords bear evidence of being blooded.
Wherever MacArthur's troops go in the Southwest Pacific, they find indigenous communities caught up in the conflict. Many liberated Pacific Islanders are keen to join combat units and fight on the side of the Allies. In Papua New Guinea, some 3,500 Melanesians serve in the Pacific Island Regiment. The troops use locals for manual labor, loading and unloading ships and trucks, carrying ammunition, and helping to clear the undergrowth. With the victory in the Admiralties, the Allies are making good progress. Instead of capturing every single island occupied by the enemy, MacArthur's strategy is to hit them where they ain't, just taking selected islands and bypassing others. On April 22, 1944, General Walter Kruger's 6th Army sets off to capture Hollandia, also in New Guinea.
Advance landing barges speed to shore under cover of fire. General MacArthur personally directing the assault. A daring thrust 500 miles beyond the most advanced point previously occupied by Allied forces driving down the New Guinea coast.
On Hollandia, Courtney links up with one of the Air Force Squadron's flying B-24 Liberators. As a decorated World War I pilot himself, Courtney loves flying. During the campaign, he often hitches a lift with friendly air crews. This mission delivers supplies to some troops who have been cut off in a landslide during the combat.
The sleepers and the drowsy ones and the thinkers among us are all suddenly galvanized into life by the sharp rat-a-tat-tat of machine gun fire. Can it be that Zeros have attacked us? Everyone is alert, and we can almost hear the heart thumps of the soldiers. But it is only our gunners in the fuselage, wisely trying out a few rounds on their guns to make sure there are no jams, and that they are ready for anything.
But on many occasions, these attacks can be for real. These Liberator bombers can be used as ground attack gunships too. They're ready to swoop down on the beaches of New Guinea and take the Japanese landing craft by surprise with devastating results. The air crews in the Southwest Pacific take great pride in their planes. They often name them and decorate them with artworks. Every air crew depends on their plane for survival, and for many, that reliance creates an emotional bond. Naming the plane and having a symbol of that name painted on the nose of the aircraft becomes a rite of passage. B-25 ground attack aircraft, C-47 troop carriers, P-47 Thunderbolts, B-32 Dominator bombers. No plane is too big or too small, and the art can be humorous, risque, or even outrageous. For the young bomber and fighter crews, these artworks offer a break from the stresses and strains of combat. As Courtney is filming with the fighting men, MacArthur's island-hopping campaign remains on the move. By late summer 1944, he's made a dramatic advance toward Japan, hopscotching 1,200 miles up New Guinea, attacking key Japanese positions and bypassing others. His troops have staged a series of surprise amphibious assaults along the way. They now set their sights on the Philippines. For MacArthur, returning to recapture the islands he'd been forced to abandon 2 years earlier is a case of personal pride. On October 20th, 1944, the largest amphibious force in history launches an invasion of the Philippines. Their first target, Leyte Island. Courtney lands on the beach with the men at Leyte to film the U.S. 6th Army spilling onto the island. It's a historic moment. A few hours later, General MacArthur himself makes a dramatic entrance. After splashing ashore, he declares the beginning of the liberation.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil.
The word went just like wildfire. MacArthur's landed, kept going through the ranks. Everybody knew who he was, and it was uplifting. We'd heard the phrase, "I shall return," over and over. It was a kind of motto, something for us to look forward to.
Victory in the Pacific depends on the fighting men, but it also relies on those who follow, in particular, the Seabees. These amphibious engineers and construction workers swoop in to build airstrips, roads, and facilities to support further operations. They carve great 17,000-foot runways out of the virgin jungle, tearing down thousands of palm trees to build them. Courtney is on Leyte for another historic moment, the arrival of female nurses in the combat zone. This is the first time in the campaign that nurses are sent in to treat battle casualties in the field, as well as those who've been evacuated from the front lines. Dave Boone, a New York Sun columnist, gives a moving tribute to the nurses.
The American nurse, at her best, is one of the grandest human beings on Earth. I guess no matter how brave and self-sacrificing any man or woman may feel today, these girls make them feel small time.
General MacArthur's great victory at Leyte helps pave the way for the Allies to advance further into the Philippines. Their next target is to liberate the island of Luzon, home of the capital Manila. In January 1945, the 6th Army heads toward Lingayen Gulf on the east coast of Luzon. This will be MacArthur's largest and costliest operation. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers are prepared for a major confrontation. They will fight to the bitter end, and they have a deadly new weapon, the Kamikaze Suicide Squadron. With the threat of kamikaze attacks on U.S. ships, nervous gunners on board fire at everything that moves in the air. Just before dawn on January 9, 1945, the 6th Army reaches the landing beaches at Lingay. Courtney joins thousands of GIs as they pour into landing craft for a full-scale attack. 900 amphibious tanks and 2,500 landing craft swarm toward shore in a dazzling display of raw power. Courtney is in one of the landing craft and films as the first waves of troops prepare to hit the shore. Conditions are perilous. Despite spotter planes above, these men can't be sure where the enemy is. Courtney's shaky shot reveals the adrenaline of the moment. But luck is on their side. A Japanese counter-assault never comes. 175,000 Allied troops land safely along a beachhead that stretches 20 miles. The liberated Filipinos greet the Allied soldiers as conquering heroes.
After we landed, the Filipinos really welcomed us. They liked us. They were all yelling Malmahay, which means hello. Then we headed down towards Manila.
For the Allies, liberating the capital will symbolize their determination to smash Japanese power in the Western Pacific. But the Japanese will fight to the bitter end to keep their hold on the city. The grueling Battle of Manila begins on February 3, 1945. U.S. newsreels report that 50,000 Japanese are killed as Allied troops battle their way toward the city. For MacArthur, it's payback time. At last, after 4 weeks of fighting, his forces liberate Manila. William Courtney is one of the first journalists to film the ruins of the Philippine capital. To celebrate the Allied victory, America's top vaudeville performer Joe E. Brown puts on a show for the troops. Nicknamed G.I. Joe, Brown works tirelessly in the South Pacific to entertain the soldiers and nurses. It was, he said, a means of overcoming the loss of his own son, Don, an Air Force captain who had died on a training flight in 1942. Brown dedicates one of his entertainment tours in the Pacific as a memorial to his son.
When I was out there alone, entertaining troops, I sometimes thought of that thing we had said to each other. I'd see a lad down in the audience who looked like my son, and I'd remember. I did meet him out there, hundreds of times.
The Allies are now preparing for the final, deadliest assault of all, the invasion of Japan itself. As American forces fight for the island of Okinawa in March 1945, they have to battle increasingly desperate Japanese suicide attacks.
One day, 4 of them started at once. 2 were shot down, the 3rd just missed, but the 4th kept coming. Coming at 300 miles an hour and finally crashed on the flight deck.
As U.S. troops are advancing on the island of Okinawa, Courtney is with the 9th Australian Division off the coast of Borneo. On June 10, 1945, they begin their amphibious assault on Labuan Island, supported by U.S. forces. Their objective is to liberate the whole of Borneo and to regain control of its rich oil fields. As the troops advance into the island, a force of several thousand Japanese defends fiercely. But they are no match for the superior Allied forces. Courtney's privileged access to MacArthur ensures that he's on hand with his camera for the general's landing just hours after his troops have secured the beaches. On Labuin Island, Courtney also comes face to face with some Japanese prisoners captured during the campaign.
Every Japanese soldier is taught that surrender is the same as death. If he surrenders, he is treated among the dead. He is told that he will never return to Japan.
But they do return. After moving to camps across the Southwest Pacific, United States, and Australia, the majority of Japanese POWs get home by the end of 1946. Only 4 weeks later, Courtney joins up with the 7th Australian Division on Borneo as they successfully launch the last major assault of World War II on Balikpapan. Though no one knew it at the time, it marks the end of General MacArthur's campaign. On August 6, 1945, comes an event that will change the world.
The Enola Gay begins the bomb run. At 9:15, the bomb is dropped. The aircraft banks away at high speed.
President Truman orders the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Then, just 3 days later, the Americans drop their second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. A shattered Japan finally accepts unconditional surrender. For the forces who have fought their way across the Pacific in one of the most brutal and costly conflicts in history, the swift and surprising end to the war comes as a mighty relief. A million-man ground invasion of Japan has been averted.
We were getting ourselves ready for Japan. I didn't expect that I'd live through it if we made the landing, so I was certainly glad they dropped those atomic bombs. That's a hell of a thing to say, but that's the way I feel.
The next day, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito takes to the radio for the first time to announce defeat. William Courtney is at General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila, listening to Hirohito's surrender speech on the radio.
The Emperor's script commenced with a masterpiece of understatement. The war had not altogether gone in our favor.
General MacArthur becomes the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. In Manila, he's now tasked with arranging the peaceful entry of the victorious Allied forces into the defeated country. His first job is to find a way to talk to the Japanese. With all communications down, he orders them to speak to him in Manila by radio link from Tokyo and sets out to arrange the first details of the surrender. MacArthur commands the Japanese to send a delegation to Manila 4 days after the surrender. It's a two-stage journey. The Japanese fly first in their own planes to the little island of Lashima. At Lashima, they transfer to a Douglas C-54 Skymaster and are flown on to Nichols Airfield outside Manila. There are nerves on both sides. This will be the first time the Americans come face to face with their bitter enemy outside the battlefield. The Japanese descend the plains, still wearing their samurai swords. No one quite knows what will happen next. The Japanese are met by Major General Charles A. Willoughby, who has been MacArthur's intelligence chief. On the surface, all seems in order, but as Courtney's unique color footage reveals, Willoughby ends up hustling the Japanese delegation into their cars. Enraged Filipinos are starting to throw rocks at them. The Japanese delegation is taken to Manila City Hall for a first conference with the Allies to make arrangements for the American occupation of the Japanese mainland. Cameras flock to the scene, but no one gets closer than William Courtney. The Deputy Chief of Staff of the Japanese Imperial Army, Lieutenant General Kawabe, is first out of the car. He finds himself surrounded by giants.
One of General MacArthur's touches was to line the approach to the City Hall with army guards, each man at least 6 foot 2 inches tall.
The conference in which arrangements for the occupation of Japan are made. The entrance of the Japanese. They are told that American airborne troops will land in the Tokyo area. The beginning of the occupation of Japan.
General MacArthur has deliberately stayed away from the Manila Conference, choosing to wait and come face to face with his conquered enemy on Japanese soil. He flies into Okinawa on August 29, 1945, in his own gleaming C-54 Skymaster Baton. This is the crowning achievement of the 65-year-old conqueror's career. The next day, Courtney and the other war correspondents make the historic flight from Okinawa to the Japanese mainland. Some 15,000 men of the battle-tested 11th Airborne Division accompany them on their 1,000-mile journey. Each aircraft carries 44 fully armed infantrymen. Remembering the treachery of Pearl Harbor, the Americans are taking no chances. By 8 a.m., the coastline of Japan comes into view on a hazy summer day.
You may imagine the feelings of all of us, especially those of us who had been with General MacArthur on the long march from Melbourne to Manila and up to Tokyo, to feel that here at last was journey's end.
When Courtney and the other correspondents land at Atsugi Airfield, the first thing they see is a group of Mitsubishi Raider fighters with their propellers removed. MacArthur has ordered this at the Manila Conference to minimize the risk of suicide attempts by Japanese pilots. The 11th Airborne Division triumphantly raises the Stars and Stripes for the first time on the Japanese mainland. Courtney is one of the first journalists to get behind-the-scenes images of American prisoners of war on their way home. Many of these men have broken out of prison camps and tramped through the countryside to reach American forces. Within 24 hours, the POWs will be back on U.S. soil. The conquering troops prepare for their victorious entrance into the Japanese mainland with some trepidation. In Okinawa, civilians have thrown themselves from cliffs rather than submit to the dishonor of surrender. Will the same happen here? Along the route to Yokohama, they see hundreds of Japanese sentries lining both sides of the dusty road.
Their backs were turned towards the American soldiers, who thought this was a deliberate insult. Actually, it was Japan's idea of the highest compliment. They felt they were not worthy to look their conquerors in the face.
The victors are impressed, if not shocked, by the mile after mile of urban devastation that they encounter. But despite carpet bombing, some services seem untouched.
When we entered Yokohama, we were surprised to still see the trains running past, when all around is desolation. Half the city is destroyed.
The defeated nation comes face to face with their conquerors on the USS Missouri at the surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay is clogged with hundreds of powerful gleaming American fighting ships. The ceremony is due to start at 9 a.m. The delegates and press crowd onto the open deck. As a friend of MacArthur, Courtney gets special access to film the historic signing from a prime position on the No. 2 gun turret far above the press pack. At 8:55 a.m., the Japanese delegation reaches the Missouri.
And a gasp of surprise swept down the ship as the Japanese Foreign Office officials headed by Shigemitsu, the foreign minister, arrived, wearing top hats and full morning coat, formal dress with striped pants.
A Japanese delegate, Toshikazu Kaze, later writes,
"Never had I realized a glance of glaring eyes could hurt so much. We waited, standing in the public gaze, like penitent boys awaiting the dreaded schoolmaster."
One man is missing, Emperor Hirohito, who takes no part in the proceedings. MacArthur has other plans for him. Finally, General MacArthur makes his entrance with Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral William Halsey.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice.
The signing of the surrender signals the official end to a savage conflict. Mamoru Shigemitsu signs, representing the Imperial Japanese government. Then General Yoshijiro Umetsu on behalf of the Imperial Armed Forces. After the Japanese, it's MacArthur's turn. Looking over his left shoulder is a symbol of the war's toll. Lieutenant General Skinny Wainwright, emaciated from 3.5 years as a prisoner of war. Then come the representatives of 9 other Allied powers. As the Japanese are led away, the victors put on one final display of triumph. 1,500 planes, Boeing Superfortresses, and Navy fighters roar across the sky.
It looked like somebody was pulling a curtain over the sky. That's how many planes there were. It was so overwhelming that we all fell down on our knees, some praying and crying. That was one time. I'll never forget that.
The only request the Japanese have made at their surrender is that the Emperor maintains his throne. This suits MacArthur, who wants to bring democracy to Japan and thinks Hirohito will help stabilize the transition to peace. In an incredible break with convention, the Emperor chooses to pay MacArthur a formal visit shortly after the American arrives in Tokyo. On September 27, 1945, security is tight at the palace as Courtney waits with the press pack. He manages to capture a rare glimpse of Hirohito on film.
We saw his car disappearing in the distance. It was an event not lost on the Japanese that a man who they believed to be a god should have to call on a mere mortal. It was by this method that MacArthur kept the emperor on the throne and issued his orders to the people through the emperor.
This photograph, taken at MacArthur's momentous first meeting with Hirohito, becomes the most famous image of the occupation. It causes a sensation when it's published in the Japanese press. In one single image, it establishes both MacArthur's authority and the fact that he will support the emperor. Just weeks after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Allied forces visit the ruined cities. Courtney is the first journalist to film both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in color. He captures endless views of urban rubble, obliterated buildings, and blasted trees. All of this destruction, the result of a single bomb dropped on each city. In Nagasaki, Courtney is mesmerized by the eerie landscape.
The Mitsubishi aircraft works here was completely destroyed. So great was the heat generated by the bomb that these works melted like wax from a candle. Survivors and eyewitnesses with whom I spoke a few days later, after we entered the city, told me that the first thing of which they became conscious was a strange white light in the sky.
In Nagasaki, Courtney also films a group of sailors from the British cruiser HMS Swiftsure, who are there as guests of the U.S. Marines. With the threat of disease and the unimaginable destruction all around, the entry from the cruiser's semi-official log delivers a poignant account.
Only a few twisted buildings stood amongst the acres of rubble. And although a few roads had been cleared, the rest was as it had fallen, with charred bones and even skulls amongst the rubble. The presence of so many small, unbroken ornaments and chinaware showed only too clearly that most of the rubble had been small Japanese homes. Most of us returned on board from our visit in an extremely depressed state of mind. And nobody was sorry when we sailed again for Kagoshima that same evening.
This isn't the last time that Courtney will travel to these ruined cities. 2 years later, he returns to Hiroshima to film another historic moment. Emperor Hirohito emerges from the mist as an ordinary mortal to inspect the atomic devastation that brought an end to his claims of divinity. His visit to Hiroshima on December 7, 1947, takes place on the 6th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Everywhere Hirohito goes, he's greeted by his people who sing, weep, and cheer their former god. The Emperor's tours, which began in 1946 and take him all over the country, place him in unprecedented contact with his subjects. His simple clothes and habit of raising his hat at the crowds, an unimaginable gesture before his defeat, become an essential part of his showing his people that he is like them, a mere mortal. The high point of the Emperor's tour comes here, standing alone on a wooden scaffold near Ground Zero. Hirohito pledges to his people that never again will Japan pursue policies that might lead to another Pearl Harbor. These moving shots mark the climax of Courtney's journey, heralding a new era in post-war Japan. This is the last time Courtney will travel through the country with his movie camera. In the late 1940s, Courtney becomes an air correspondent and occasional war correspondent, writing on Korea in particular. But the amateur films he shot during the war in the Pacific and in Japan will have a lasting legacy. After the war, Courtney's films are hailed as one of the only authentic records in color showing the stirring events before and after the fall of Japan. They're shown to captivated audiences throughout the United States and Great Britain, including screenings at the White House and in the British Parliament. For Courtney, what he had seen and lived through in the Southwest Pacific would stay with him all his life. He had witnessed images of great horror and great heroism, and seen history in the making as he followed the Allied fighting men in their epic struggle toward victory. And what he saw was captured in color for the ages.